Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. On June 17, 2015, Dylan Roof, a young white male, opened fire at the historic Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, killing 9 black worshippers. The massacre has sparked conversation online and in the media on the persistence of racism against African Americans in the United States. Why does racism still persist in the 21st century despite decades of struggle for equality? Joining me is Dr. Shabir Ali to discuss racism from an Islamic perspective. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So can you share with us your initial thoughts on the Charleston shooting?
Yes, as you refer to it as a massacre, it's a terrible tragedy, and it makes us feel that in our places of worship we are not safe, and obviously authorities need to make sure that not only places of worship but citizens in all facets of life are safe to carry on their business of living and preaching and worshiping.
So how does Quran address the issue of racism and, extending beyond that, the issue of class and privilege and this whole notion that because you're made a certain way or you're from a certain culture that you're better than others?
The Quran in the 30th chapter, in the 22nd verse, shows us that it is God's plan to create the diversity that we witness now, and we can appreciate the nature of that plan when we see a bed of roses of different colors. If everything is of the same color, then it's not as attractive as if we have like a well-arrayed mixture of various colors complementing and contrasting with each other. So the human race is like this, and that's one of the marvels of God's creation, according to that verse.
And there's also no place for arrogance, because obviously in this situation, it was claimed, some media outlets have noted that Roof's approach was that of a white supremacist, and where he actually said, some people are claiming that he actually said, I want to kill black people. So this whole notion of, and this idea of arrogance also doesn't exist in Islam.
Yeah, obviously we shouldn't want to kill anyone, and anyone of a particular race for that matter. The Quran in the 49th chapter in the 11th verse calls on humankind to recognize that God has created us from a single origin and made us into nations and tribes, لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you may know each other, the Quran says. And that would be in contrast to being in conflict with each other. So you should know and recognize each other and deal with each other in kindness. And the same verse continues to say that the most noble of you in the sight of God are those who are most aware of their duty towards God. So one cannot say I'm superior because I'm either white or some other color, or superior based on ethnicity or language or region or any such issue related to oneself. The important thing in the eyes of God is who is most dedicated to carrying out the commandments of God.
Can you also share, I think it might be of value to talk a little bit about Satan and how he didn't, when God had asked him to bow down to Adam, he didn't, because there was this whole notion of arrogance and the idea that he's better than man.
Yes, this original story teaches us that there's no room for arrogance and boasting of one's own self-worth. The story in the Quran is that when the angels were told to bow down to Adam, they all bowed down except for Satan. And when he was asked, why did you not bow down? He said, Adam is made from clay and I'm made from fire. He means to say that I'm superior to him. Fire is stronger than clay. But what was important at this point was for him to obey the commandment of God, regardless of his own feeling of superiority, but his pride prevented him from obeying God's simple command. And then God says to him, get out of here, there's no room here for this kind of arrogance. So if we think of the first crime in our historical origins, in the story of our human life, that's the pride that Satan displayed.
Looking back to the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, do we know of any black companions and their status in society?
Yes, and of course this shows the openness of Islam to people of all races. The Prophet, peace be upon him, had adopted a boy, Zayd ibn Harith, And he is known to have come from a region where people were dark-skinned. And his son, the son of Zayd bin Harith, was known as Osama bin Zayd. This was quite a beloved person to the Prophet, peace be upon him. And it is also known that Bilal ibn Rabah was of Abyssinian origin, and he was a slave at one time, and then the Prophet's companion Abu Bakr bought him in order to free him. And so he became a freedman, and he was the first mu'adhin or caller to prayer for the Muslims, and his call to prayer is still being repeated by Muslims today throughout the world.
So I think this is very valuable because it shows historically and within the life of the Prophet there was no room for racism at any point in time.
No, and the story of Osama bin Zayd is actually especially instructive in this case. Well, even to start with the story of his father, Zayd bin Harith, who was adopted by the Prophet, peace be upon him, and eventually the laws that came to be revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, cancelled adoption but allowed for fostering in order to preserve the actual genealogy and biological identities of each individual. But still, the Prophet, peace be upon him, continued to love Zayd bin Harith, and he had actually married Zayd to his own cousin Zainab. And now he continued to love the son of Zayd, Osama bin Zayd. And I started by saying that his story is particularly instructive because it is mentioned in some of our classical sources that on one occasion the Prophet, peace be upon him, was at Arafah, where people go to perform one of the rites of the Hajj pilgrimage. And now we have to conceive of people then all leaving at the end of the day, and people wait for their friends and their close ones, their relatives, to make sure they all leave together and nobody is left behind. The Prophet, peace be upon him, is noted to have waited for Osama bin Zayd, and naturally his companions and other Muslims waited along with him. And eventually, who turned up to be Osama bin Zayd, to the surprise of many onlookers? It was, as described in the sources, a black boy. And the Yemenites, who were Muslims there waiting with the Prophet, peace be upon him, were so shocked by this that they reneged from Islam altogether. They couldn't continue to follow the Prophet, peace be upon him, because of the preference that the Prophet, peace be upon him, gave to this, that they regarded as a black boy and therefore of someone of insignificance. And they could not get their heads around the fact that the Prophet, peace be upon him, kept everyone waiting for this boy. Mm-hmm. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, loved him, and that shows that yes, there was this openness in Islam to people of all colors, and there's no discrimination if we understand and practice Islam properly, as the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself did.
So I think this gives a good segue into my next question. So how can we address what could be argued as systemic racism? So to give you, some context to that, media is defining the incident as a tragedy, and some other media outlets are saying it should actually be called a terrorist attack or a hate crime. This has also brought up the discussion of the Confederate flag, which some are arguing could be, some media outlets are saying it could be a symbol of supporting slavery. So we're actually, if you think about it to a certain extent, within a system that sort of fosters racism. So how can we address that?
On the matter of terrorism, I haven't seen too many voices speaking in this vein, but Anthea Butler wrote an article in the Washington Post, which then was reproduced in the Toronto Star. And her basic argument is that if this crime was committed by a person of color, then very quickly it will be labeled as a terrorist act. And it seems to fit some definitions of terrorism, in that there is a political motive here associated with this. There is an attempt to achieve political change by slaughtering civilians. But why is it not called this? And everyone moves in to think about the mental state of the criminal. Maybe he's mentally ill or something like this. So some excuse is given to personalize the individual. Whereas if it had been done by a person of color, very quickly we see labels being put out, and somehow that individual becomes, the criminal that is, or the accused, becomes depersonalized, and becomes part of some large impersonal force that is out there, some bogeyman that is out there to get us. So I think that's that gives us a cause for pause. When things like this happen, it is, yes, important that we understand the individuals as individuals, we sympathize with people, and we try to understand the root cause of crimes in order that we can root them out completely and effectively. And so we must explore all avenues in such an analysis, but let's do it systematically, not just for one and not for the other. As for the Confederate flag, as you know, many of the critics are looking at it as a representation from a historic past that is rooted in slavery and segregation and prejudice against black people.
So Dr. Shabir, what can we as a community do to address sort of the systemic racism that we're seeing, or that we see in our communities?
I think we need to have more dialogue, more introspection. We need to look at our history, see where we have traveled, and look at ways of moving forward for a more egalitarian society and an end to racism and prejudice and discrimination of all kinds. The case of Malcolm X is extremely instructive in this regard, in that it shows that one can, by associating and traveling and meeting other people, can see how some model societies may function in this way. Malcolm X had the slave name Malcolm Little. He abandoned that name when he associated with a Muslim movement that emphasized the value of black people, and he adopted instead the name X instead of Little, X for the unknown, not knowing his original name. But when he traveled to perform the pilgrimage in Mecca, he wrote back to his wife Betty saying, "I have associated with Muslims whose skin is the whitest of white and whose eyes are the bluest of blue, but we've slept on the same rug together and ate from the same plate." They ate from a large plate. And he said, "I felt no sort of discrimination from them, but only the brotherly feeling as all one." And then he wrote back to his wife Betty, concluding in his letter saying, "America needs to understand Islam." Well, Islam is one of the religions that emphasizes the equality among people, and we find that to be a very strong emphasis in the religion of Islam. So Muslims in particular should share the message of Islam and Islam's message against racism with the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.